violent exorcisms, torture, burning at the stake. Just more dark secrets they tried to sweep under the altar. They called them brides of Christ, chaste, pure, above earthly lust. But here's the secret they don't want you to know. Pregnant nuns weren't rare. They were an epidemic of hypocrisy scrubbed from the record. But before we talk about punishment, let's ask, how did it happen? Not always lustful nuns sneaking off. Sometimes it was the confessor, the visiting priest, the bishop's envoy, even local nobles treating the convent like their private hunting ground. Pregnancy was scandal. Scandal damaged the church, so they hid it. Records hint at forced abortions, babies buried in convent gardens. Yes, really. Holy ground turned graveyard. These were silent births no one was supposed to witness, and the church couldn't have that. So they called it discipline, purification. But we know what it really was. Polite words for pain. Picture Sister Agnes, 23 years old, stomach swelling under her habit, terrified of hell, but more terrified of the abbess's icy stare. Whispers in Latin, excommunication. The rack, if she named names. If she was clever, she blamed the devil, said it was a demon, an incubus, anything to avoid naming Father holier than thou. And sometimes it worked, because the church loved demon stories, loved proving power with exorcisms that looked a lot like torture sessions. And that was only the start. Humiliation in front of the convent, flogged in the chapter house while chanting psalms, stripped of vows, expelled to beg in the streets, or locked in a cell barely bigger than a coffin to meditate on her sins. Sound medieval? It was, but also methodical, documented with wax seals and careful Latin. Bureaucratic cruelty disguised as salvation. They don't teach you this in school. They want stained glass and choirs, not chains and screaming women. But let's open the door wider, because this was just the foyer. Next, we're walking into the inner sanctum where they really cleaned up these scandals. And trust me, it gets uglier. Think this was just personal sin? The church called it a plague on the soul. They had cures for that, and not the kind you'd want. Because once that nun's belly swelled under the habit, it wasn't just scandal. It was evidence. Evidence of moral rot they insisted on cutting out, metaphorically or literally. And here's the dirty secret they locked in vaults. They loved blaming demons because it kept the men in robes clean. Records from Italy in the 1600s show tortured nuns confessing they'd slept with incubi, that a demon climbed onto them in the night. Not Father Carlo, not the bishop's envoy. No, just Satan himself making her a mother. Sound convenient? It was, and inquisitors wrote it all down. Pages of confessions forced with the rack creaking in the background. Latin phrases like spiritus malignus next to an inked thumbprint shaking with pain. Let's see how they handled it in France. Heard of Laudun? A convent of Ursuline nuns screaming they'd been possessed, that the devil violated them nightly, their bodies convulsing in public exorcisms, priests chanting, crowds watching like it was theater. And they got their scapegoat, Father Urbain Grandier, burned alive as a sorcerer while the church pocketed the scandal as proof of its holy mission. They don't teach you this in school. They want you to think the exorcism was about saving souls, not torture sessions designed to get nuns to shut up about real fathers. And Italy wasn't shy either. Manuals for exorcists prescribed binding possessed nuns hand and foot, pouring holy water over them as they screamed, interrogating them between prayers until they named the devil, and only the devil. The church loved these confessions because they sanitized the crime. Case closed. No priests punished. Imagine Sister Katerina, dragged before the chapter, her face grey with terror. She knows the game. She's seen it before. She names Satan, because naming Father Antonio means the rack, means being burned as a heretic. But sure, call it justice. They kept records. Neat, organized, stamped with wax seals, documenting demonic visitations and successful exorcisms. Not the bruises, the blood, the broken minds. But that was just the start, because they didn't stop with forced confessions. Next, they'd prove the devil was gone by purifying her body. And trust me, that got even uglier. Think the confessions ended it? Not even close. Because once the church had its proof of possession, it needed to purify her. And purification was just another word for controlled violence. Start with public humiliation. Picture a nun, belly still soft from a lost child, forced to stand before the convent. The entire sisterhood chanting psalms, while she knelt half-naked on stone floors. Abbess reciting prayers for her corrupted soul. Punishment designed to break her spirit in front of God and everyone else. But they did not stop there. Records from monastic chapters show corporal punishments. Whipping in front of the community, the lash striking flesh while the litany continued. The rhythm of prayer matching the blows. They called it correction. But correction bled. Inquisition manuals describe how certain unrepentant nuns might be locked in cells so narrow they could not lie down, forced to meditate on their sin while their legs cramped and sores rotted. A living coffin with a cross carved into the door. Salvation through starvation. And then there was permanent confinement. Once a nun was judged unclean, she might be walled up in a monastic prison. Not a symbolic sentence. Actual iron-banded doors. No visitors except confessors. Meals slid through a hatch. Years spent hearing nothing but your own prayers and your own screams. French ecclesiastical records from the 17th century detail abbesses requesting approval for perpetual enclosure for scandalous sisters. One letter described the nun as tainted beyond hope after childbirth. Tainted, as if she were spoiled meat. Of course, the church offered mercy. Sort of. Stripping of vows. Expulsion. No home. No dowry returned. Cast out as a fallen woman. No convent would take her. No family wanted her. A convenient way to dump the problem onto the streets. Because nothing says forgiveness like destitution. And in certain courts, the charge escalated. Fornication with demons was not just sin. It was heresy. Witchcraft. That meant trial. Torture. And yes, burning. You can find inquisitorial records describing questioning that started polite and ended with the rack. Clerics asking about pacts with devils, demanding names of accomplices. While the nun's joints popped under the strain, she confessed everything they wanted, because the alternative was silence with splintered bones. And they wrote it all down. Pages stamped with the seal of the Holy Office. Neat Latin catalogues of human misery. They called it justice. They called it saving souls. But let us be honest, it was control. Control of women's bodies. Control of fear. Control of the story. And that story only gets worse from here. Because next, we see how even exorcism turned into something you might mistake for an execution. If you squinted. Now imagine the exorcism chamber, because sometimes they decided the devil himself was the father. Problem solved, right? Blame the supernatural. But it also meant the nun was now evidence of evil in the convent. Cue the exorcists. Monastic records describe them arriving with bell, book, and candle. Holy water sloshing onto cold stone. Candles guttering in draughts that smelled of mildew and fear. The rituals were not gentle. Manuals from the 15th and 16th centuries spell it out. Binding the accused. Reading the exorcism formula while she screamed. Sprinkling her so hard it soaked her habit. Demanding the demon reveal itself. You think that was theatrical? Of course it was. But it was also pain. Some exorcists used heated iron crosses pressed to the skin to drive out the devil. Imagine the sizzle, the smoke rising, the priest yelling Latin while the nun wept prayers for mercy. In France, records from Loudun in the 17th century detail entire convents in supposed possession. Nuns convulsing, screaming obscenities, accusing priests of carnal acts with demons. The public loved it, came to watch, a spiritual peep show, while exorcists declared it proof of Satan's corruption of women. Psychologists today call it mass hysteria. Back then, it was admission of guilt, confession on stage. Once you screamed the right words, they had you, bound by your own testimony, because a woman's pain was always suspect, but her confession under agony was gospel. Some claimed the devil forced himself on them. Records note specific confessions of night visits by a dark figure. Descriptions remarkably consistent across continents, because it was the one excuse they could hope might save them. Blame the devil, spare the living man. Yet even then it was no guarantee of mercy. Inquisitors debated how to test possession. Some suggested pricking the skin with needles. If she did not bleed, she was marked witch, heretic, fit for fire. And when they tired of exorcisms, they could always escalate. Trials, torture on the rack to verify the truth. Parchment records show careful notes on how much to tighten the ropes, so the joints cracked but did not dislocate. Efficiency in cruelty. Some nuns did not survive. They broke bodies, minds, faith, all delivered to the church as proof of its holy authority. You do not hear that part in the tourist tours of cathedrals. They show you the stained glass, not the iron cuffs, the choir loft, not the whipping post, because it was all part of the system, a system built on terror, on making sure no other sister thought to confess pregnancy or question the men in robes. And if you think that is the bottom, wait, because next we see the final punishment. When even exorcism failed to cleanse the scandal, they turned to the flames. Now picture the final solution when prayer, penance, and torture failed. Fire, the church's favorite cleanser, because some nuns were not just disciplined or confined, they were executed, publicly, spectacularly. Trial records from inquisitorial courts tell the story in cold Latin. Charges of heresy, witchcraft, consorting with demons. Pregnancy was evidence, proof she had lain with Satan. No need for the father to testify. She incriminated herself by her own swollen belly. Judges in Italy and France described it as extirpating evil, a gardener's term, weeding the faith. Except these weeds screamed. Execution manuals specified the method. Tie her to the stake, pile the wood, light it slow. So she had time to repent, time to beg for mercy they would not grant, Spectators gathered. A lesson for the city. For every nun watching behind monastery walls. Step out of line. Lose your soul and your skin. And it was not always fire. Monastic prisons existed across Europe. Rooms the size of coffins. Nuns walled up alive with only a slot for bread and water. Reflection, they called it. A lifetime of whispered prayers in the dark. No trial needed. Just an abbess's nod and a mason's trowel. Others were whipped in public. Documented chapters held ceremonies where the sisters chanted psalms while flogging the guilty. She might be stripped of vows, turned out in rags, branded as impure, forced to beg in the streets she once walked in holy silence. Inquisitors boasted of their mercy. They preferred confession, repentance. But if that failed, the rack was waiting, carefully designed, screw by screw. They noted the number of turns, wanted her to break, not die too soon. Useful testimony was valuable, a spectacle that served a purpose. This was not rogue cruelty. It was policy, stamped and sealed. Parliamentary acts, canon law, monastic rules copied in careful script by candlelight. Listen to the language. Purification, correction. They used words that sounded gentle, holy. They taught novices to chant them, to internalize them, so that when the day came, no one would scream too loudly. This was the price of being a woman in the medieval church. Your body was property, your purity, public currency, your sin, a spectacle for others' salvation. And they do not want you to know this. They show you ancient chapels with faded frescoes of the Virgin. They skip the part where real women bled on the floor, because in the end, it was never about saving souls. It was about control, punishment dressed as penance, fear branded as faith. So next time someone tells you about the glory of the medieval church, ask them about the nuns who screamed in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, ask them where they buried the babies. Because history did not forget. It just hoped you would. And now you're part of this secret. If you want to uncover more of history's dark past that they tried hiding from you, subscribe. And click the video on the screen to see the truth behind Bloody Mary's nickname that they don't want you to know about.